Bom dia a todos. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos para o nosso segundo dia do nosso evento. É uma alegria contar com todos vocês aqui. Hoje nós temos, então, a conferência de abertura com o professor David Wigg-Wolf. Então, eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação do professor. Desde dezembro de 2008, o professor Wigg-Wolf é pesquisador associado do Instituto Arqueológico Alemão, em Frankfurt, e editor principal da editora local. De 1974 a 1986, trabalhou na Royal College, Universidade de Oxford, de 1974 a 79 com literatura e humanidades. Em 1977, trabalhou com o tema honra e as moderações na literatura grega e latina. Em 1979, lecionou na Final Honor School of Literary Humaniores. It's difficult to pronounce. Sorry. História Antiga e Filosofia. De 79 a 81, desenvolveu estudos de pós-graduação na área de arqueologia romana. Em 1986, defendeu a tese de doutorado The Circulation of Bronze Coinage in North Gaul in the middle 4th century AD. The Numismática Evidence for the Usurpation of Magnentius and its Aftermath. É membro do conselho editorial da revista científica Moneta, além da Journal of Archaeological Numismatics and Journal of Ancient History and Archaeology. And I'm very glad to receive you here for our event. So I'm very happy. So you can start, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wagner. And first of all, a very, very big thank you to the organizers for the invitation and also for the way they've been looking after us the last couple of days since we arrived. Eaten far too much, but it's been absolutely wonderful. So thank you, and it's wonderful to be here. Coins, or to be more precise, perhaps money and religion, are very closely interwoven. And this is perhaps best illustrated by the link between various words for money and the temple of Juno Moneta in Rome, which was the site of the first Roman mint. The temple was dedicated on June the 1st, 344 BC, and initially had nothing to do with coinage. According to Cicero, the epithet moneta came from the Latin word monere, to warn. Supposedly during an earthquake, a voice from the temple warned the Romans to do penance by sacrificing a pregnant sow. And we find this link between, I'm going to be doing this all the time. I'm going to be pressing the keys on my laptop when I want to be doing this one. I wonder where the slide was. We find Juno Moneta commemorated on Roman coins, quite clearly linked to, so we have moneta here, quite clearly linked to the striking of coinage. And even today, for example, in the Isle of Man in the United Kingdom, we have a crown coin with a statue of Juno Moneta on the back. And one of my favorites, it's very difficult to read at the bottom here, but this is Juno Moneta's credit card in the Archaeological Museum in Madrid. But the very close link between financial institutions and temples is perhaps best illustrated by two episodes in the life of Jesus, which are to be found in the New Testament. The New Testament is a rich source of information on everyday aspects of life in antiquity and provides a number of examples of the different ways in which ancient coins, of the way in which in the ancient world coins were intricately interwoven with religious practices and institutions. The first episode I would like to refer to demonstrates the very close relationship between financial institutions and temples. It's the story of Jesus cleansing the temple in Jerusalem, which had become the location not just for the sale of articles associated with temple ritual, but also financial transactions. And I think you all know this story very well of throwing the money changers out of the temple. And temples were regularly, okay, it's done it, putting Mac onto PC, and the formatting of the text goes somehow, but I think you can see enough of it. Temples were regularly used as deposit banks in antiquity, and here you can see two examples from Greek texts illustrating how the temples at Ephesus in present-day Turkey and Hierapolis in Syria served as places where money and other valuable items could be stored for safekeeping. So temples were kind of like safe deposit boxes. But sometimes they weren't quite so safe. Things could go wrong. The Temple of Peace in Rome was destroyed by a fire in the late 2nd century AD, and we learnt that this fire in a single night made paupers of many rich men. All Rome joined in mourning the public loss, and each man lamented his own personal loss. The second text, one of my favorites, because temples could also be robbed. And we learn from a legal text of the early 3rd century AD how a young man hid in a small chest and had the chest placed in a temple. After the temple was closed at night, he climbed out of the chest and stole many things belonging to the temple before again shutting himself up in the chest and waiting to be collected the next day. He got banished to an island for this. But today I would like to consider two aspects of this relationship and how money or coins were interwoven in a number of different ways with religion in the ancient world. And in particular, in the Celtic and Roman worlds, I do a lot of work on the Iron Age in Northwest Europe, so this will be the area I'll be concentrating on. On the one hand, I'll be looking at the role that religion and religious content plays on coins, and on the other hand, the role of coinage and money in ritual and religious practices in the Roman world. And coins are a source of such rich and varied information, and are so closely interwoven with a wide range of social practices. This is due to a great extent to their very nature as a combination of material, text, and image. This is something that coins have, which is very special. And beyond this, and this is something you referred to yesterday in your paper, coins operate at different levels, being struck and issued as an official medium, but they then enter the more everyday environment of circulation, and even if the circulation could sometimes be officially regulated. And it is important to bear this very multifaceted character of coinage in mind when we consider the relationship between coins and religion. So they can talk about very many different levels of what's going on. But before looking at coins, the role of coins in ritual, just a very brief look at the other way round, the role of religion on coins. We can start maybe by looking at the Roman Republic. From its very beginnings, the Roman coinage, like the coinage of classical and Hellenistic Greece before it, often displayed religious content. Initially, this generally came in the simple form of the use on the obverse of the coins of busts of various gods, which were frequently, although not exclusively, used to differentiate individual denominations. For example, on the early bronze issues of 280-276 BC, the ass was distinguished by the head of Mercury and the semis by the head of Minerva. Although it would be misleading to see the delivery of a religious message as the primary purpose of these busts, it is nevertheless significant that religious motives were chosen to guarantee the coinage, much as a temple, that of Juno Moneta, was chosen as the site of the Roman mint. It was only in the late 2nd and the 1st century BC that religious content and connotations on the Roman coinage changed, when the tres vidi monetales from the aristocratic republican families, who were responsible for producing the coinage, began to use coin designs as a means of presenting the past achievements of their families in order to promote their own status. And this was then further developed by individuals. Thus, in 47-46 BC, during his campaign in North Africa against the remaining supporters of Pompey, Julius Caesar had denarii issued that illustrated on the reverse in Aeneas, the mythical ancestor of the Julii, carrying his father Anchises from the burning city of Troy following its capture by the Greeks. Although the goddess Venus appears on the obverse of Caesar's coins, she does this in part in her role as the mother of Aeneas and so as an ancestor of Caesar. So she plays a role in his personal status. Mark Antony, on the other hand, aligned himself politically very clearly with the Greek East and Cleopatra when he produced silver denarii with the head of Jupiter Ammon, whose oracle was in the oasis of Siva in the Egyptian desert. Here you see Mark Antony very definitely as an Eastern power. This was the coinage that was then inherited by the first Roman emperor, Augustus, who used the medium in very much the same way as his Republican predecessors, as part of the mechanisms designed to maintain the power base of himself and his family. And again, we can use a biblical episode to illustrate this, the story of the tax coin that is recounted in the Gospels. Jesus was asked by some Pharisees and Herodians whether or not it is right for Jews to pay the taxes demanded by Caesar. In the Gospel of Mark, the additional provocative question is asked, shall we give or shall we not give? Jesus first called them hypocrites, but then asked one of them to produce a Roman coin that would be suitable for paying Caesar's tax. One of them showed him a Roman coin, and he asked them whose head and inscription were on it. They answered Caesar's, and he responded, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Sorry, Haim, it's not a Rembrandt. I apologize. The tale is a remarkably potent statement about how the Roman imperial coinage was perceived in the ancient world. It was very clearly the emperor's coinage, and it was in this function that religious content was employed on it. This is reflected in the coinage of the empire, for generally speaking, when a deity, when a god is introduced on the coinage, then it is most often employed in some kind of relationship to or as an attribute of the emperor. For example, on a sestertius of Vespasian, Salus, who is seated on the reverse, is Salus Augusti, so the salvation of the emperor, while on a denarius, an aureus, struck for Faustina II, the wife of Marcus Aurelius, Venus Genetrix, as the goddess of motherhood and domesticity, appears as a reference to Faustina's role as the mother of Marcus's children and to the future of the Antonine, the imperial dynasty. And in the late 3rd century, Aurelian is receiving a globe as a symbol for the world and his dominion over it from Jupiter, here on the right, as the guarantor and source of Aurelian's power. And this use of references to a deity continued after the introduction of Christian symbolism. Initially, Christian content generally only appeared in a subsidiary role. For example, what initially is the eagle-tipped scepter of the emperor now becomes a cross scepter. And whereas here, victory is inscribing an altar with Vic-Pa, victory over the Parthians, later inscribing a Christogram on the shield, a Christian symbol. Christianity just comes in as one of the little mechanisms of explaining imperial power. But Christian iconography could also be employed to emphasize the divine nature of the emperor. This medallion of Constantine I, showing him being crowned by the hand of God appearing from a cloud. So very much the divine nature of his power. But the most famous example is perhaps the wedding solidus for the Eastern Emperor Marcian, struck in AD 450. On the reverse, Christ stands between Marcia and the Emperor Pulcheria. I apologize, this is the only example of this coin. It's in bad condition, but this is the head of Christ between the two. The symbolism is particularly significant. Theodosius II, the emperor, had died without children, and the marriage between the new emperor and Theodosius II's sister secured Marcian's succession. But Pulcheria only agreed to marry Marcia on the condition that he did not violate her long-standing vow of virginity. So in order that the marriage should not seem to be scandalous, the church proclaimed that Christ himself sponsored the union and it therefore should not provoke shock or unjustified suspicions. And this is illustrated on the reverse of the coin where Christ stands between the couple. This is the first representation of Christ on a Roman coin and is a particularly potent example of how religious content could be used on the coinage to promote imperial identity. And if religious content was used on the Roman imperial coinage to present a particular image of the emperor, the coinage of the cities of the Greek East during the Roman Empire was very different. providing as it does at the same time both a contrast and a parallel to imperial coinage. It is a parallel in that, as a rule, the bust of the emperor or a member of the imperial family is to be found on the obverse, and the coins were struck in the emperor's name. However, it is a contrast in that it is no longer the emperor and his virtues that we find at the center of the program on the reverses of the coins, and religious aspects play a very different role. Instead of references to imperial deeds and virtues, we find references to elements of the self-representations of the cities, for example, to local deities and their temples, or to myths related to the cities. At Miletus, the cult statue of Apollo at the nearby oracle of Didyma was portrayed on the reverse of the coins. At Ephesus, it was the famous temple of Diana, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And the reverse of the coins of Abydos display the legend of Leander swimming across the Hellespont to his lover, Hero. Here too, religious content was one of the tools used to present a particular identity, but it is the identity of the issuing cities rather than that of the emperor in whose name the cities struck the coins. Now, when considering the role that religious content played on Roman coinage, it is perhaps useful to turn to an ethnological model of money and its social functions. Jonathan Parry and Maurice Bloch differentiate between 2 related but separate transactional orders. On the one hand, transactions concerned with the reproduction of a long-term social or cosmic order. On the other, a sphere of short-term transactions connected with the arena of individual competition. This long-term order is concerned with the attempt to maintain a static and timeless order. While Parry and Bloch apply the concepts to the social framework of the economic function of money, it also provides insight into the social and political functions of the iconography and how religion was being instrumentalized in the ancient world. At the end of the Roman Republic, the choice of motives for the coinage was linked to competition between the various aristocratic families and factions, and here involves coinage at the level of individual competition. This is the sphere of short-term transactions as defined by Parry and Bloch. Similarly, the coinage of the cities of the Greek East during the early and middle Roman Empire have an element of the short-term sphere in that cities used their coinage to present their own identities as part of the competition between polis. This contrasts starkly with the role of religious content on the coinage of the Roman Empire, which was clearly intended to underpin the power of the emperor and thus the long-term cosmic order. In this respect, the provincial coinages of the Greek East present an interesting hybrid, for while the reverses are generally located in the short-term realm of competition between cities, the obverses parallel the imperial coinage in portraying the emperor and the reproduction of the long-term order. However, when we turn to the Iron Age Celtic coinage of Northwest Europe, the situation is appreciably more difficult, as we more often than not, have little or no understanding of the imagery of the coins or of its significance. For example, where an early Celtic coin imitates a Macedonian prototype with the head of Apollo on the obverse, perhaps even copying it exactly, is the head on the copy still a reference to Apollo? What were the intentions of those who were responsible for the creation of the Celtic coin, and how did they perceive the head? And how did those who used the coins interpret and understand this head? As for later Celtic types with original iconography, here we are often at a complete loss as to what the imagery means. For example, what is the meaning of the bird's head, which you see here, on the obverse of many of the rainbow cups produced in southern Germany in the late 2nd century BC? And what about the turquoise, the neck ring on the reverse? Is it the symbol of power or kingship that we know from the early Iron Age? Wonderful. I pressed the wrong button, got to the wrong place on my presentation. Is it the symbol of power or kingship that we know from the early Iron Age? For example, here on the statue of a Celtic prince from the Glauberg near Frankfurt, and here you see him wearing a turquoise around his neck. Or has the turquoise on the coin taken on a new meaning? And what was the precise... I'm going to get this right at some point. what was the precise meaning of this rather strange snake, which we can see coiling around the obverse of this coin, for example, from southwest Germany, from the 1st century BC? The trouble is, the simple answer to all of these questions is that we just do not know. We do not understand the iconography of many Celtic coin types, and it is important to remember this when we analyze the function of coins, and in particular that of Celtic coins within a religious context. For the language spoken by the coins and the manner in which it was understood and interpreted by users will have had an effect on the way in which the coins were employed. However, Celtic coins are more informative when I now come to the second part of my paper, looking at the role coins and money played in religion and religious practices and how they were used. Of course, today we can think of many ways in which coins are used, have been used for religious practices. Here, for example, an example of a coin in a burial. Now, is this Charon's obol, or is the coin here just jewelry because it's been pierced to be worn as a pendant? We start to get very difficult questions of the interpretation when we start to look at how coins are being used. Today, people throw coins in fountains, but what exactly is the meaning of this? And in Britain, there is a very, very strange habit of sticking coins in trees. Initially, this started as a religious idea. The first recorded cases from Scotland from the 19th century. But now people just put coins in trees because there are other coins in trees. Why are they doing it? In the Middle Ages, a very interesting practice in England was to fold coins in two. So you take the coin and you would fold it like this, and these would often be placed as offerings in connection with a miraculous healing or some miraculous event that had taken place. So, any analysis of the use of Celtic coins in religious contexts has to rely mainly on the archaeological record, to some extent maybe on ethnographical parallels, for the ancient sources seldom make any reference to coins and their use in the Celtic world. So this is a problem of interpreting archaeological data. But how can the archaeological record illuminate coin use and religion? In answering this question, it is important to differentiate between two aspects that are often confused: religion and ritual. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines ritual as an adjective as follows: of or relating to rites or ritual, according to religious law, done in accordance with social custom or normal protocol, adding for the noun, which you see at the bottom here, an act or series of acts regularly repeated in a set, precise manner, which doesn't have to be anything to do with religion. While according to this definition there can sometimes be a link between religion and ritual, it is also clear that ritual can be free of any religious connotations or elements. However, in all cases, there is a standard structure or procedure that is to be followed, a clear sense of repeated or repetitive action or performance. The behavior of football fans, for example, is in many ways ritualized. Very distinct rituals are performed by fans at soccer matches. But is it a religion? Well, I guess it depends whether or not you're a football fan as to whether or not it's a religion. But this is an important point. Just because things are repeated in a way, it doesn't mean it's religious. It can be ritual without being religious. And even if something is happening in a church, does it mean it's religious? For example, this church from Bunga in Gotland, in Scandinavia, there are lots of coins found beneath the floor. Are they there because people have offered them deliberately, or did they just fall between the cracks in the floorboards? So even here where you find coins in a church, the fact that they're there doesn't mean that they are necessarily religious offerings. So let us now look at some examples of the role of coinage in religious and ritual practices in the Celtic world of Western Europe. I would also like to look at how practices changed after Rome conquered the area and it became part of the Roman Empire. Even before coinage was used in the Celtic world, objects which appear to have a monetary function were being deposited in often large numbers. There is some disagreement about why such hoards were deposited, but the more generally accepted interpretation is that they had some kind of ritual or religious function and were not just simple stores of monetary value. The earliest hoards containing coins from northwest Europe are a series of hoards of gold coins dating to the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC, and these often contain other gold objects such as turquoise and arm rings. And here, 2 examples from Snetism in England and Basel St. Louis Kegelris on the French-Swiss border. And such hoards are found across much of France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and as far south as northern Italy. Just like the Bronze Age hoards, there has been much argument about how these hoards are to be interpreted, whether they are simple savings, emergency hoard buried in times of danger, for example, the invasions of the Cimbri and Teutones have been suggested as an explanation here, or whether they are just offerings to the gods. Interpretation is made all the more difficult by the fact that the majority of these hoards were not associated with any structures, but were buried in the open landscape, and so they have no archaeological interpretation to help us, archaeological context to help us with the interpretation. Nor can we tell whether they were deposited near any semi-permanent natural features such as woodland or a tree. In some cases, they seem to have been associated with water or wetlands, for example, at Latane on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, which is strictly speaking not a hoard, but where large numbers of objects, including coins, were deposited in the lake beside a bridge. The situation at Niederzier near the Lower Rhine in Germany is unusual. The hoard was deposited by a post. It's actually this feature here on this slide. It was deposited near a post or a totem within a settlement, possibly in connection with the abandonment of the settlement, suggesting that here there was indeed some kind of religious context. And the clearest case is perhaps Snetism, which I showed earlier in East England, where a large number of hoards were buried within a ditched enclosure on a prominent hillside. So you have this ditched enclosure here with an entranceway and this whole number of hoards here. And clearly, this concentration of hoards in one place is not just a storage of wealth. There must be some kind of religious significance of these. So the hoards quite clearly do, in some cases, have a religious context. And we can then move on to look at some individual cases, a couple of sites I'd like to look at in southwest Germany. For example, here, Rheinheim-Horris, which is on the French-German border. There is this strange structure, circular structure here of a double row of posts. This square feature here is a later Roman pool, has nothing to do with the earlier structure, but you can see the post holes here. And this has been reconstructed as some kind of circular building with an ambulatory. That reconstruction is very contentious. But the interesting fact is that this structure then has a large number of coins in the post holes of the structure. Here, the stars represent coins which were found in the post holes of this structure, and quite clearly we have here some kind of foundation deposit when the structure was built. It's very unlikely that so many coins were simply lost when this was built. And actually this dates 150, 100 BC and is probably the earliest documented case of a foundation deposit which we have in northwest Europe. The second site I would like to look at is the Marzberg, which is a Romano-Celtic sanctuary and a settlement above the river Mosel, which you can see flowing past it here on this picture, on a hilltop overlooking the river Mosel. Some of the temples have been rebuilt today, so you can visit the site. And I would like to look here at the central building. First of all, the central temple, which was in this sanctuary, which has 6 or 7 temples at various times. And coin deposition starts in this area here around 70 BC. And let's look at this area. It starts as a rectangular ditch with an entranceway here, and coins are being deposited just to the left of the entrance to this rectangular enclosure. It looks like when you go in, you deposit a coin. This is just a ditch with a grass surface. Here there are a couple of posts by the entrance. You get an idea of what it looked like. They may actually have hung offerings up on this post, which later have fallen down and entered the ditch and the ground. And as time goes on, more and more coins get deposited at this site, still being deposited at the same area, but at this point now we have some kind of structure which looks like a temple. You can see the post holes for this wooden structure, for example, beneath later stone buildings. So we have a wooden structure here looking much like this, and the coins are being deposited at the entrance to that. But then suddenly, after the structure is built, coin deposition stops at this particular area. We can look at coin deposition across the site generally. We have just looked at this little feature here, but you can see coins are being deposited at other areas as well. But as time goes on, we're going to see a movement from this area here. It's still, during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, still very important, but after the Emperor Augustus, when the temple was built in the center, we have no more coins being deposited in the center, and coins are being deposited now in an open area, and this is important, it's an open area between two temples, between Temple M and Temple L here. And after the middle of the 1st century AD, suddenly we find no more coins being deposited, or we find no more coins in the temple. So for 200 years, these are all the coin finds that we have from this site. I'll come back to this a little later. But one of the significant features of this site are the chop marks which we find on the coins. The coins have been marked with some kind of tool, and you find these chop marks on the reverse of many of these coins. The gold coins are very brittle, and they break in two. This is an interesting coin because these two coins were found several meters, well, these two halves were found several meters apart on the site, and suggest that this marking of the coin was actually done at the temple. It's not done beforehand, they're marked, and the two halves then, when the coin breaks, get deposited in the ground. And we should also note that many of the coins are marked in a very, very similar way. It's a very standardized procedure, this marking. There are lots of them. It's very high value coinage, gold and silver that's being done. And they are quite clearly grouped around the temples. This is not simply checking to see if the coin is pure metal. This is very, very clearly related to what is happening with offerings at the temple. And it's very reminiscent of what we find at some other sites. For example, a large number of gold statues of the Parisii, so from the River Seine near Paris, have a similar mark on the horse, on the reverse of the coin. They're always marked in a very identical way on gold coins. And there is a hoard from La Villeneuve au Château, Roman bronze coins in this case, where they're all marked very similarly with a cross-shaped mark on the obverse of the coin, on the head of Augustus. Now, the fact that the coins with chop marks are so numerous and are found on high-value gold and silver coin, as well as the fact that the marks are so standardized and regular, suggests that these are not offerings made by individual people, but that they were large communal offerings made by a group of people. And we should also note that similar defacement is also known from the Iron Age for other objects, particularly from burials. For example, weapons were bent or broken in a manner that was intended to make them unusable in this world. They were ritually killed and transferred to the beyond, to the world into which the deceased, which the dead in the burials themselves had passed. By analogy, we could think that the coins were rendered unusable by the chop marks and were visibly and recognizably so. They could no longer be used. They too had been removed from circulation, richly killed and transferred to the realm of the divine. And we could perhaps think of these folded coins from England also being changed in a way that meant they could no longer be used as coins. They were quite clearly offerings. After the Roman conquest, we find very different chop marks on the coins. They are now no longer so regular, and you can see these are very different kinds of marks. All of these coins really are marked in very different ways. Here are a whole series of them on the reverse. Here we've got two. Interesting pattern on this one. They are being marked in a very, very different way. And now for the first time we find them not on gold and silver, but on low-value bronze coinage. This suggests that we are no longer dealing with the communal offerings that we have for the Celtic world, but now with offerings made by individuals. What is more, although these individuals were aware of the practice of chop marking, they no longer conform to the strict practice of the late Iron Age. Here it is not sufficient, there's not sufficient time to go into details, but the development is clearly related to changes in social structures after the Roman conquest and how this affected religious practice. I'd also like to come back very briefly and point out that just like on the coins of the Parisii here, also at the Markberg, it's generally speaking the horse on the reverse of the coin which is marked. Now it has been suggested that the reason for this is that these coins are acting as a substitute for sacrificing a horse. But there are two problems about this. One of them is that it's hard to find a Celtic coin at this time that does not have a horse on the reverse. And we don't understand the symbolism of these coins. We do not know what the obverse means. Is the obverse a divinity like the head of Apollo? And then you'd never, ever chop the head of the divinity. And we also know from the Irish medieval record that the horse was a symbol of kingship. So kind of the symbol of this world. So perhaps they're chopping the horse because it's what marks the coin as being a thing of this world and marks the coin's value, and are then killing that value to move it to the other world. Now I say this because this is the problem with Celtic coinage. We do not understand the imagery, and because we don't understand the imagery, there is something about what they're doing with these coins which we cannot understand. We can make suggestions, but we really don't know what the answer is. But coming back to the chop marks, gradually the practice of chop marking dies out, and a Celtic practice comes to an end around the mid-1st century AD at the Markberg, as you can see here, and also at other temples in the area which also practice this. No longer were coins marked to remove them to the other side and deposited as offerings. This reduction in the occurrence of chop marks also coincides with a significant drop in the number of coins found at the Markberg overall, which we saw earlier. And a similar break is known from a number of other sanctuaries in northern Gaul and Germany. While this may be the result of changes in ritual and practices that followed upon the transformation of religious beliefs which made coins unsuitable for offerings, maybe people saw coins in a different way and you just didn't offer them, other, more profane explanations should perhaps also be considered. At the Markberg, we saw that the focus of the depositions of coins initially concentrated on the entrance to the small, square, ditched enclosure, but the focus then shifted to an open area between temples L and M, soon after the first temple buildings were erected in the centre of the square enclosure. It would seem that the deposition of coins and the presence of substantial buildings was incompatible. And when the sanctuary was finally rebuilt in stone in the late 1st century AD, the coin series at the site breaks off completely. Now this was of great significance, for it meant that when coins were deposited, they now remained visible on a concrete or a stone floor. As we have seen during the late Iron Age and early Roman periods, coins were deposited in ditches or in open areas, sometimes around posts. Now on such natural surfaces, small articles such as coins, although initially visible and accessible, would after a while become inaccessible, washed into ditches or simply swallowed by the vegetation. The grass grows over them, people tread them into the ground. With the advent of stone architecture during the Roman period brought with it gravelled, paved or even cemented surfaces, coins and other votive objects no longer disappeared into the mud or grass, and instead the nature of the new surfaces made objects deposited on them more accessible. The surfaces could also be kept clean and swept. This will have required new practices and behaviour with regard to such objects. The lack of coins struck after the mid-1st century AD at the Martberg and other sanctuaries does not therefore necessarily mean that coins were no longer the object of ritual or religious activity there. Any objects deposited now could be collected for redeposition elsewhere or might even be reused. In this connection, it is significant that from the late 1st, early 2nd century AD, we encounter evidence in Northern Gaul for a new practice with regard to coin offerings, collection boxes, thesauri or Opferstock is the German word. One example in the form of an altar to Linus Mars, incidentally the god who was worshipped at the Martberg, was found at the Mingert sanctuary at Trier, about 100 kilometers away on the River Mosel, and dates to the mid-2nd century AD. Now the coins placed in such containers, and here you can see where the coins could be put into the altar. Now coins placed in such containers could have been recycled, perhaps to pay for the upkeep of the sanctuary, or even to pay for sacrificial offerings. And a much quoted text by Arrian, written at about this time, gives an indication of how this may have worked. And he says, when the year comes round on the return of the nativity of Diana, he's talking about hunters, so Diana as the goddess of the hunting, the treasury is opened and a victim purchased out of the money collected, either a sheep or kid or heifer, according to the amount of the sum. And then after having sacrificed and presented the first offerings of their victims to the goddess of the chase, according to their respective rites, they give themselves up with their hounds to indulgence and recreation. So we can see the hunters collecting coins and then using the coins later, but they're offering the coins to the goddess, using the coins, transferring them from the box to an animal, kind of a reverse of what we might have seen with sacrificing coins with horses, to turning them into a sacrifice. Now, this recycling of offerings may explain why the practice of chop marking coins also ended in the late 1st, early 2nd century AD. If one of the purposes of chop markings was to symbolically mark the coins offerings to the gods that could not be reused, the practice became redundant in a context where now reuse was possible. So you wouldn't mark a coin if you were then going to want to use it to buy a sacrificial animal or to pay for the upkeep of the temple. And that this was possible, now coming to another ethnological model or economic model, that this was now possible was due in part to the development in the use of coins that had taken place in Northern Gaul generally in the preceding 2 centuries. With the appearance of low-value bronze coinage in the 1st century BC, coin use had expanded from the level of high-level special purpose money. So in the early Celtic world, we have large gold coins and turquoise clearly being used as special purpose money, but with the invention or the introduction of small bronze coins, it's starting to be a special purpose money that can be used in different ways. So coin use had expanded from the level of high-value special purpose money that could only be used in a limited, closely defined number of spheres or roles to a form of general purpose money that allowed conversion between the spheres. And we can perhaps now see the same development in the way coins were used in the context of ritual, deposition, and religion. More specifically, we can now see the last point here, which is important about general purpose money. General purpose money facilitates conversion between the different spheres of monetary use. And perhaps we can now see this conversion within the religious sphere, between the sphere of the sacred, of coins being sacrificed, to the sphere of the profane, coins being used to pay for a sacrificial victim. The coins were originally sacrificed offerings, but now became a financial medium. And the use of a thesauri of collection boxes will have facilitated this. And Arrian's description of the use of money collected by the hunters is a good example of transformation. And here we can see, coming to my closing remarks, here we can see again a very different aspect of this, how money on the one hand and religion become very, very complex. Initially, we've seen very much more a sort of symbolic relationship between the two, where it's the symbolism of the temple as a place of safekeeping, a safe place to do transactions with things. Here, we're now actually coming into a very different world, where the introduction of money as a general purpose medium actually introduces a very different relationship between religion and coinage. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor David Wigg-Wolf. It's a very interesting conference. So I think we have time for some questions. Okay. The microphone for Professor Chaim Gittler. Do you have? This is it's very
the chopped coins, do you find them only in temples, or you also find them in other places?
We do find them in other places, but then often without a context, so you don't know. It's difficult. The situation may be different in the east, on the Danube, in the Eastern Celtic world, where there are a lot of coins which are marked, and we don't really understand why they are. These coins are mainly coming from the trade with no context, so it's very difficult to interpret. But in the northwest, in the Celtic northwest, these chop mark coins seem to be coming always from either from a temple site or from a complex or from a context which we could interpret as being in some way religious. Some chop marks quite clearly will have been to test the coin, but the Maartberg is a very clear case. For example, we have a big settlement at the Maartberg. It's an oppidum, so a Celtic early town. We do not find the chop mark coins in the town. We only find them around the temple. There is clearly a relationship between the two.
Because the finding of in the east, farther east, we call them not chop marks but test cuts.
Yes, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
And in our area and more in the east, there is a specific also. If you check the coins, let's say the Athenian owls,
yeah,
most of them will have a test cut between the eyes of the owl.
Yeah.
And then we probably, I don't know if we never relate them to temples in that case, because
yeah,
they were not found. But in that case, we know that they did it specifically all the time, and they tried to do it in the same place, not to obliterate the image of the coin.
Okay, that's interesting. In this case, these chop marks were thought to be test marks, like what you're talking about, but it was actually the excavations at the Maartberg where we could then show that these coins were only found around the temple, where it became clear that there is something religious involved. It was the site of the Maartberg that showed this, and also the fact that the coins of the Parisii, the gold coins with the chop mark, tend to come from the river, and we know in the Celtic world there's a very close relationship between offerings and water, and that gives that another religious context. But it seems to be different to what's being done elsewhere.
And is it very common that these coins are fake or coated coins, or have a core which is not?
No. These are pure gold, pure silver coins. They are not.
So you rarely find the.
Yeah.
Because that's okay. That
No. These are because
difference.
Yeah, because you can see the gold coins have often broken, so you can see inside them, and you can see they are not plated. They are solid gold coins. It's interesting how people try to interpret these things in a historical context as well, because the coins of the Parisii, with the chop mark, were used to date them to the Gallic War, Caesar conquering Gaul, because the suggestion was the Celts didn't have enough money and therefore were making bad coins, and they were testing the coins to see if they were good. And this could only happen at a time of stress when Caesar is fighting the Gauls. But we now know from archaeology that these coins are much earlier. So that was a case of thinking it's a test mark being used to date the coins. But no, it's a different thing.
And just another remark I showed Francois during your lecture. There was a coin at the Bibliothèque Nationale, a Rhodian coin, a fake from the 15th century.
Yeah.
That has the legend Imago Caesari, related to the story of what's Caesar is Caesar.
Ah, okay. I don't know that one. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not Rembrandt, but it's...
I should point out that Heim was complaining before my paper that he has a picture, a Rembrandt with the temple coin, and he was complaining about this.
Okay, now Claudia now.
I have two very quick questions. One has to do with this. Are we certain that it is defacement?
Could you approximate your mouth? Yeah, yeah.
Did you hear?
Yeah, whether it is defacement.
Absolutely sure that it's not anything else.
Are you sure of anything in archaeology?
No, not at all. But I mean, that's the current. Aren't there?
Yeah.
It's not controversial. It is defacement. That's
all I can say is that this takes place at a temple site. It's associated with temples.
Yeah.
And that we have from burials, particularly from burials, the same kind of thing happening to other articles. I should point out that Celtic coins did not go into burials. It's very, very rare to find coins in Celtic burials, so we don't find it there. It's an analogy. It's an interpretation. I think it's almost certainly the case.
Okay.
But yeah, I would say 90% certain.
Okay. And the second one is the deposit when it's on the ground.
Yeah.
The first ones. Did people not bury the coins? Did they lie around on the surface?
Well.
Can we know that?
You have to, when thinking about what a Celtic temple looked like with a grass surface, I always think of Western movies where there's always a scene where the high street is mud and someone just falls in the mud. When it rains at these sites, it's a quagmire. And things will disappear into the ground. They just won't be visible. I think you have to think about what kind of surface you're dealing with. The vegetation grows. If just for 3 weeks no one's there for some reason, because these sites are not being visited regularly, often people are only going there on particular occasions, 3 weeks later, it'll all be invisible. But we also know that from the Roman sources, they found it remarkable that there was gold lying around in Celtic temples and no one was touching it. It was absolutely sacrosanct. It was the death penalty to remove objects from a Celtic temple. So there was no problem with these things lying around on the surface for them. They could stay there, but they will have disappeared into the ground very quickly. I'm sure that's the case. You have to think about it's not like the grass outside here. It's something very different. People are walking over it and treading things into the ground.
The Marburg site is really wonderful, and with the different phases, and it reminds me of the Coran in France, where you have exactly the same thing with all the coins grouped at the entrance.
Yes.
But then you realize that there is a lot of other materials, other kinds of evidence, and a lot of beds. I mean, there are much more beds than coins actually. So my question is, in Marburg, do we also find a lot of other kind of things? Or
yes, there are other offerings.
It's always interesting, just not to take into account only coins, but.
Yeah, no, we do find other offerings. We find weapons. The god probably from the central temple is Linus Mars, so a war god. So we find a lot of weapons. Some of them have actually been bent as well. We do find them there. Fibulae, brooches, for example. We do find various metal objects. But the Martberg is a site with coins. This sanctuary alone, just the sanctuary, Celtic and Roman coins has 10,000. It's a place where you deposited coins for some reason. It's a huge... 10,000 we know of. a 19th century excavator records that the people who lived in the village at the bottom of the hill made their wedding rings from coins from the top. And everyone in the village had a collection, a few coins from up there. There's something very special about coins at this particular site. I don't know anywhere that has produced quite so many. We have several thousand Celtic coins alone. Yeah.
More questions? Okay, we have one question there.
One too.
It's difficult for the people at the back behind you then.
And this is important because the camera too.
Assuming if the chop-marked coins could be recycled and regain some sort of value, is it too ambitious to come up with exchange rates or equivalence rates for items that have been chopped, and to see what kind of devaluation or appreciation in value they would have by re-entering their monetary role, or also trying to come up with tables to equate a chop-marked coin or a number of chop-marked coins to other goods or weapons. Is it too ambitious to think about coming up with such equivalences?
For the Iron Age world, that's impossible, because we know absolutely nothing about the value of these coins in the Iron Age world. We also have to understand that the price structure in the ancient world was very different. I mean, like, the relative value of copper and an egg will have been very different in the ancient world to what it is today. So it's very difficult to do one-to-ones. But if you look at this, this is the 2nd century AD, and Arrian is saying this is what they pay for when they hunt. So they pay 2 oboli for every hare that they catch, a drachma for a fox, and 4 drachmas for a roe deer. This gives you perhaps some kind of understanding of the value of animals, but of course this is not a direct correlation in what it actually cost the animal at the market. We don't really know. Only going into the Roman period do we know about equivalences, what things cost. Of course, with Diocletian's price edict in late antiquity, you then get a very good idea of price structure. But certainly for the Iron Age world, I'm afraid we just do not have any sources that could let us know what the value is. No. These coins will often have symbolic value as well, not just the value of the metal, so that makes it very difficult.
I have one about the coins in the church.
Yeah.
All these of the same people, or other peoples came to the church to deposit your coins?
In the case I shown, it's in Scandinavia, where you have like one coinage for a big area. So there are no local coinages, so you can't really tell where the people are coming from the coins, because it's just Viking coins of a Viking king in this case. So it's very difficult to know what the situation is there. It's not actually something I've looked at, I must confess, so I don't know whether in other cases there's people have looked at that. What's quite interesting is there are records of, in Scandinavian churches, the women sat on one side and the men on the other side, and the coins tend to be on the side where the women sat. Whether that is significant is another matter, or whether this is just pure coincidence. At least a couple of cases that's been documented, but it's hard to know where the people are coming from.
Okay, so thank you very much again. Now, I love it, so wonderful.